Hi. I would like to start by welcoming all of you to today's timely and topical event. My name is Hamza. I'm from Algeria Solidarity Campaign, an organization that has been around for 2 years. We are campaigning for peaceful democratic change in Algeria, and we are striving to build a platform for debate and exchange of ideas regarding the challenges facing the Algerian people. So if you would like to know more about us, you can visit our website at algeriasolidarity.org. You can come and talk to us, and don't forget to add your name to our mailing list. So we chose to give today's event the title of Algeria, Mali, another chapter in the global war on terror, because of all the declarations we've heard from the leaders of the Western powers before and during the military intervention in Mali and after the tragic hostage crisis in Algeria. So we heard French President François Hollande saying that his country will be in Mali as long as it takes to defeat terrorism in that part of Africa, but he failed to mention that it could go on indefinitely. British Prime Minister David Cameron, in a ludicrous statement, declared that Britain faced an existential and global threat to its interests and way of life before promising that a generational struggle would be pursued with iron resolve for decades. We also saw how Hillary Clinton was pushing for more American involvement in the conflict and heard about the US deal signed with Niger to operate military drones. After a decade of lost wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and 2 years following the NATO onslaught on Libya, it seems that a new front in the war on terror is being fought over, and it could be a potential disaster for the region. We are led to believe that the French operations are being carried out to liberate the Malian people from the Islamist extremists. We were and we're still bombarded by the narrative that there are no other alternatives. Africa needed its ex-colonial master to come and save it. This sounds like racist imperial hubris. Is it really about fighting terrorism, or are we witnessing a struggle for strategic control over the continent's vast natural resources? Do Western interventions achieve stability? Were there other alternatives to tackle these issues? To answer these questions and give us a perspective from the Global South, we are delighted to have four brilliant speakers with us today. Explonani Kofi is the director of the Kilombo Center for Civil Society and African Self-Determination in Ghana and the coordinator of Another Word is Possible radio program on GFM in London. He was the coordinator of the campaign against proxy wars in Africa from 2005 to 2010. Sami Ramadani is a senior lecturer in sociology at London Metropolitan University. He has been an active participant in campaigns against Saddam's regime and in anti-war and anti-imperialist struggles for many years. He writes and speaks widely on the Middle East issues and is a Guardian contributor. Kevin Bismarck-Cobham is a criminal law solicitor advocate, a community activist, and member of the National African People's Parliament Legal and Constitutional Subcommittee, broadcaster, and also member of Another Word is Possible radio collective. Walid Khalifi is an Algerian activist and journalist specialized in the Sahel, North and West African affairs. He writes for Ceasefire and African Energy. Walid is also a co-founder of Pan-African Collective of Photojournalism and multimedia storytelling called Afrik Yemma, which means Africa, the motherland. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our speakers.
Welcome all of you to today's event, and thank you for taking time off your busy schedules to engage with us here. I've been asked to look at my impressions of the French intervention in Mali, its implications, and what actually has influenced this. In fact, I see the French intervention as a continuation of the attempts by the Western countries to control the resources of Africa. And I see at the bottom of this the Berlin Conference, which divided the African country, the terrain among the various Western countries without any respect for the internal cohesion within those countries. And after the Second World War, what has happened has been an expansion of the number of countries which are involved by adding North America to the Western European countries. And the way in which these countries have been shaped has created a situation in Africa, a situation which I refer to as a situation of proxy war, a situation where you have internal tensions within countries, internal tensions which are capitalized on by the same Western countries and used as a reason of constantly interfering under the guise of trying to hold these countries together. The fact that the countries were actually created as extensions of these Western countries means that they were divided between, you have English, French-speaking, Portuguese, and Spanish-speaking, and there's a certain relationship between the particular colonial countries which took these territories when they met in Berlin. As a result of that, the kind of even political structures which have been built are extensions of political structures in these various countries. And so the tensions which are even created in the countries are actually supervised by the Western countries. And even in situations where you have a large land spans where people speak the same language, have the same religion, has one dominant religion, like in the case of Somalia, they had to divide it between French, English, and Italian, so that there's a kind of proxy extension on behalf of three Western countries among people who speak the same language and have one dominant religion. And this kind of situation has been at the root of a lot of the post-colonial tension on the continent. As a way of trying to consolidate this and trying to have a total control over the resources of the continent, there has been a military presence, military pacts with various countries, and now you have the U.S. African Command, which is AFRICOM, which has been established to represent America's interests. They claim that AFRICOM, in concert with other U.S. government agencies and international partners, conducts sustained security engagement through military-to-military programs, military-sponsored activities, and other military operations as directed to promote a stable and secure African environment in support of U.S. foreign policy. And this support of U.S. foreign policy has been part of a networking of the various Western countries. The other thing which is also present here has been the competition between China, which is an emerging economic force, and the Western countries on one side. It was in October 2006 that there was a Sino-African conference where 50 African heads of state met the Chinese leadership to conclude on deepening economic and trade relations. Around that same time was the groundwork for AFRICOM. And by December 2006, AFRICOM recommendations have been made. February 2007, the presidential OK has been given to AFRICOM. So even the coincidence in the period in which they are emerging shows that to a certain extent, the competition between China and the West, I do not try to separate USA from the rest of the Western country. I put them all together when it comes to here. And that what is happening is that the US has now become the leading force among the Western force on one side, and China and other countries which are emerging on the other side. China specifically increasing its trade relations, increasing economic involvement with the continent. The Mali, the country which is being referred to with the present problem, is the third producer of gold. It has other minerals like uranium, diamond, and there's a lot of interest in Mali's oil at present. Many of you know the role that oil has always played in Western interests in various other countries in the South. And this has been a source of interest in the Middle East in particular. The impression that France has gone in to go and ensure stability and security, when I read what was said about AFRICOM, two words emerged there: stability and security. France has been at the root of the problem. Because when the Mali was going to become independent, the sections which have become Northern and Southern Mali today were made up of people who have not had the best of relationships. There was a certain kind of suspicion because the Arabs and the Tuaregs in the north have raided the south in the 18th and 19th century for slaves. And so there was a suspicion of those seen as slave raiders and those who, because of the previous slave raids, were actually suspicious of the slave raiders, and the slave raiders not also having a good relationship with those people. So the Tuaregs requested that they requested from de Gaulle that they should have their own country in the center of the Sahel. But instead of doing that, the Tuaregs were divided between Burkina Faso, Libya, Algeria, Niger, and Mali. And then this means that the tensions from the colonial and pre-colonial period were carried into the post-independence, post-colonial Mali. When Mali became independent, its first president was a progressive president, President Modibo Keïta. Modibo Keïta was left-wing, he was Pan-Africanist. He took Mali out of the French community and also built closer relations with Eastern Europe. The French were not very happy about this. For those who know the record of the French relationship with Guinea, when Guinea said no, the way they went to remove everything that they thought they had contributed to, they're not taking into consideration that it's the resources of the people of Guinea that were used in building those things. So, but after Mali's independence, Mali, Ghana, and Guinea set up an organization of progressive African states, Ghana-Guinea Mali Union. They were in the forefront of convening the All Africa People's Conferences. The All Africa People's Conferences adopted a resolution on neocolonialism in 1961, and it was decided that in 1964 there will be a conference in Bamako, Mali, to develop a strategy for fighting neocolonialism in Africa. This actually, the French were not very happy about. And between the Third All Africa People's Conference, which adopted that resolution, and the scheduled Fourth All Africa People's Conference to come on in Mali, was the first Tuareg rebellion in 1962. In the end, the conference didn't come on in Mali. Modibo Keïta gave up. He went back to the French community. But 1 year after he went back to the French community, there was a coup, and he was overthrown by Moussa Traoré. Which clearly, when the Western countries are against you, no matter how you bend backwards, we've seen it with the way in which even Gaddafi toned down before the invasion of Libya recently. So no matter how you bend backwards, the position will not change. And the same French who are intervening now for stability and peace are known to have invaded before the independence and taking properties and livestock belonging to the Tuareg. So they are known to have also done a kind of distraction, which we have been told that the Islamists are involved in northern Mali. So if they have that track record, then what is going to make them change now and behave differently from what they have done previously in the same territory? Yes, so this is the issue which we are looking at. Now we have been told that they are going in for the Islamists. In fact, even if you look at the history of the way in which the Islamic so-called terrorist groups have emerged. The Al-Qaeda, which is the mother organization of the Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda emerged in Afghanistan through the Western countries' own proxy war against the Soviet Union, trying to prevent Soviet Union funding these supposed Islamist militants, and which led to the creation of Al-Qaeda. Then down, you have Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group was supported strongly by the Western countries. Some of the Tuaregs who have gone now into Mali were fighting forces within the Libya Islamic Fighting Group. So here you have the same human beings being supported in one country, not even saying that they are alike, but the same human beings supported in one country, moving back into another country, then you are going after them. So the duplicity of the West's involvement in this, it cannot make us take the Western involvement seriously at all. The other thing has been the involvement of the IMF and the World Bank, which I'm sure during question time I'll be coming to. After Modibo Keita was overthrown, it led to increasing involvement of the IMF and the World Bank. It affected the conditions in Mali, and it is responsible for some of the conditions that we have today. In terms of giving a development capacity for the state, since 2005, USA had various programs, Trans-Saharan Counter-Terrorist Partnership, and other programs with the Mali and other countries. They've put in $500 million into this project. If that has not been able to help build capacity for the Mali army, what is going to make this intervention build capacity for it? To end here, I'll say that the world we live in today was not always like this. It has been shaped this way by human beings. And it's again human beings who will be able to reverse it. And that is the task of you and I. Thank you.
Thank you, Explore. Sami, that one works? Yeah.
Okay, can you hear me there? Okay, what I will focus on in the 10, 12 minutes that I have is to highlight the connections between the fight for democracy and the fight against imperialist domination and control. And what I propose is that the two struggles, the struggle for democracy and the struggle against imperialist domination, are very, very closely interlinked. They boil down to the same fight. And if one side of the equation is downgraded or neglected, then we get a situation that the other part of the equation becomes totally dominant. What I mean is that, and in the context of what has happened in the Middle East and North Africa today, we see two types of positions, arguments that we need to be wary of and cautious in supporting. One is to argue that it is okay for the imperialist powers to intervene where there is a humanitarian threat, where there is the likelihood that people will be massacred, where there could be genocide, and that such an intervention has at its roots a humanitarian mission that should be backed and supported, regardless of what went on in the past. So people who said, but Saddam's regime was backed by imperialist powers for so many years, they gave him chemical weapons and so forth. And the retort to that was that that was in the past. Now we're talking about a genuine threat of genocide against the Kurdish people, against people in southern Iraq, and so on. There is an emergency situation that we need to tackle. And that emergency situation dictates that our humanity, our compassion, our concerns should be directed at helping out people in desperate need. That is the type of argument they used. Obviously, they used a package of lies about WMD and so on. But at the heart of it as well was this appeal to our humanity, our compassion. And on the other hand, you had a situation where parts of the opposition to imperialist domination and control argued that one should forget completely about Saddam's anti-people record, genocidal policies, using chemical weapons against his own people, and so on. We should forget about that and focus on fighting imperialism, full stop. That has strong appeal. I was, for example, part of the opposition to Saddam's regime. I was very active against Saddam's regime. But I could not possibly reconcile that struggle with supporting imperialist intervention and invasions and the 13 years of sanctions that preceded that imperialist war of aggression against the Iraqi people. That does not mean that I no longer was part of the struggle for democracy in Iraq or for democratic rights or for radical change, social change, but it does mean that the way I looked at it, and I think the way most Iraqi people, despite appearances to the contrary in terms of the Western media, the way I looked at it was that the two are inseparable. The struggle for democracy and the struggle against imperialism are inseparable. And as the drums of war were being beaten, and as the U.S. Forces were gathering momentum to launch that war against the Iraqi people, it was quite obvious where the main danger came to the Iraqi people, that it was the U.S. bombers and the jackboots of occupation were threatening the Iraqi people in a way that they have not seen for centuries. And true enough, more than 1 million Iraqis paid for that war with their blood. What was dished out as humanitarian intervention translated into a war of genocide, I would say. And some 4 million Iraqis became refugees, 2 million external, 2 million domestic refugees, displaced people. The silent killers, what I call silent killers now in Iraq, are legend. The headlines don't handle this, but waterborne diseases are on the rise in a very alarming fashion, especially amongst children, because of lack of electricity that used to power the sewage plants, so the sewage is being pumped into the rivers. Women, we heard a lot about interventions to liberate women, whether in the context of Afghanistan or Iraq or future interventions. Women have always featured in imperialist propaganda. And the reality is today in Iraq, despite many, many decades of enormous achievements by women through their own struggle and demands and contributions to public life, women dare not walk the streets of even Baghdad once sunset dawns. It's quite a frightening deterioration in the condition of women, and I don't want to go through a catalog of disasters that happened to Iraq, but the situation is absolutely deteriorating. And for the first time, one of the consequences of occupation is that we might be heading for civil war as well in Iraq. Now, how does also this relate to problems in general in the Middle East? And I would suggest North Africa as well. One thing we need to keep in mind that the news headlines do not necessarily coincide with the actuality of a lot of the conflicts that we witness. So when we have enormous headlines about humanitarianism, then we need to question: are these headlines coincidental? Do they really reflect the actuality of a conflict or a struggle? And the way I tackle this is to go beyond the headlines and always keep in mind that there are problems in the Middle East, in North Africa, which have common features. That these regions have been colonized. They came under colonial rule. That the current imperialist powers that want to intervene, they were either the former colonial powers, or in the case of the United States, which posed as the anti-colonialist power post-World War I and post-World War II, they have joined in the struggle to control the resources of the region and replace some of the old colonial powers. The United States replaced Britain, France, Italy, and much of the Middle East and North Africa. Now, what are these underlying problems that we need to focus on? Oil and gas, energy resource, very important, obviously, for obvious reasons. But there is one reason which is often forgotten about oil, petroleum, the raw material. This raw material goes as a vital raw material in just about all modern industry. If you look around this room, if you look at our computers and so on, you'll see modern plastics and materials go into the entire modern industrial complex that is being built around the world by major capitalist corporations. And this fundamental raw material goes way beyond oil is being merely a source of energy. It's a vital raw material of modern industry. So when they say, we can go and buy the oil from anywhere, the Arabs are not going to drink that oil, they have to sell it to us and so on. The question that is forgotten is that whoever not only satisfy their own needs of oil, but whoever controls that resource will have a major advantage in the conflict between powers. Explo explained the contradictions between China and the United States and other powers in Africa. There has always been a power conflict, power struggle in who dominates these energy resources and raw material wealth of the region. So, for example, Japan has only 6 months worth of reserves of oil. Japan, a great industrial power, could be crippled if somehow they cannot get access to importation of oil. 6 to 9 months. They have extended it a bit in recent years. So you could see that this conflict over the so-called Greater Middle East is really a vital cornerstone of not only attempts to satisfy their own capitalist economies, but to deny their competitors dominance over this vital resource. Trade is very important. Trade in arms, it comes either first or second in priorities in world trade. They pump armaments into this region like no other region in the world. Saudi sheikhs, Gulf rulers, the oil-rich countries of these regions go cap in hand in terms of trying to get more weapons in return for supplying the United States and the West and Russia as well with armament, trade in armaments. Israel is vital. The interests of Israel, the way Israel has become a really crucial base for U.S. imperialism across the world. Israel's role is not only Middle Eastern, but is global. It's a major nuclear power with some 200 nuclear weapons at its disposal. So Israel being part and parcel of U.S. global strategy is very important to always bring into the equation because it's an important factor in Middle Eastern politics. Geography, strategic region. I know I have only 1 minute left probably, but I finish on this. Who fears democracy? I think there are two forces to keep in mind who really fear democracy. The domestic dictators and reactionaries and those who exploit the people, torture them in prisons, fight against their interests, and you could include the entire Arab rulers from Algeria all the way to the Gulf. They fear democracy. Domestic reaction, those who exploit the people fear democracy. But imperialism also fears democracy. Because if the people emancipate themselves, achieve democracy, rule over their affairs, then imperialism will not have a standing in the region. They will lose their control over oil, they lose their control over trade, they will lose their control over this vital strategic reason. So these are the two enemies that fear democracy. And unless we take all this on board, we do fall into quite complex and sometimes misleading analysis of the situation. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to Algeria Solidarity Campaign for inviting me to speak today. Can you all hear me? Okay. Imperialism fears democracy. I want to talk about the legalities, the illegalities, the use of humanitarian intervention for the purposes of the commission of crime. And I want to talk about what those crimes are. If I could start by talking, first of all, I've kind of set this out like a legal brief, so forgive me if I'm going to be moving from paper to paper, but that's how I'm used to talking. The French fear democracy. The French say that they are intervening in Mali because they were invited to do so by the Malian government. Prior to the intervention, they didn't recognize the Malian government. There was a coup. We know there was a coup. That's why we're here talking about Mali. That coup got rid of any semblance of constitutional or popular legitimacy for anything which could call itself the Malian government. In the late part of last year, in October, November, December, the ECOWAS states, the economic regional states of West Africa, were moving together in a slow process, an embryonic process, to bring some kind of negotiation, some kind of roundtable discussions as to how to resolve the turmoil and the disorder in Mali. The French had been pushing for their lackeys in ECOWAS to speed up a military intervention, which would have been African-led. So everyone would have thought, well, that's all right, it's African-led. But behind the mask of an African-led intervention, the proxy war interests of imperialism, with the French at the forefront, would have been secured. However, there was, in my estimation, some concern amongst French circles as to whether or not their interests, their imperialist interests, would play out, which was why Sonogo and his, he was the soldier who led the coup back in March. He came back on the scene again, leader of the military junta, got rid of the puppet prime minister in December of last year, because those negotiations may have led to a widening of that Malian constituency, that Malian grassroots constituency, which would speak to democratization. It would speak to a way of solving Malian problems, not from blitzing them from Mirage jets above, but from below. Resolution 2085, which was the United Nations resolution, it was passed on the 20th of December, and the Security Council used its Chapter 7 authority to authorise the deployment of foreign forces to Mali. So that was the green light for foreign forces to intervene in Mali. But Resolution 2085 was about an African-led intervention, an African-led support mission. Now, when you then add other reasons for the French intervention, you see that the French were not relying on international law, but they were using legalities and the legitimacy of human rights intervention to mask imperialist intentions. They also talked about third-party defence, and given that the Malian government, which has no constitutional authority, had invited them in, and every state has a right to self-defence, therefore, under international law, they were acting legitimately. But this was an internal, not external, threat to Mali. Internal. The situation where you have an internal threat doesn't constitute a situation which allows a foreign military power to intervene in the domestic affairs of a sovereign state. We've seen the situation. We were talking today about another chapter in the war on terror, and perhaps the French are looking at a Hamid Karzai type situation, where we have a local leader who he may get upset from time to time. He may have to raise voices from time to time about drones blitzing wedding parties, etc. But he is the local agent. He sanctions the occupation of his country for imperialist ends. We now have a similar puppet situation in Mali, where a local puppet, I can't even remember his name. I can't remember the name of the bloke who said, French, come in, but is doing precisely the same in Mali for similar imperialist interests. What we need to do, I could go on in detail. When I was asked to speak by my brother Hamza, I like talking about law, so there's lots of different aspects which one could engage with. One could also talk about the justification which the French use called imminent threat. The French would have us believe that aside from Resolution 2085, aside from the invitation on behalf of the ECOWAS states, aside from that, there was also an imminent threat to France itself. Bush and Blair talked about an imminent threat coming from the non-existent weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Blair lied in Parliament and said, I'm going to get some water because my lips are going dry. But Blair said, and no one believed him, but except the lackeys in Parliament, Blair said that Saddam was had the capability to blitz London with rockets within 45 minutes or something of that ilk. He told that lie in Parliament, whilst Colin Powell was at the United Nations talking about other lies in relation to the weapons of mass destruction in terms of imminent threat, but on the basis of the use in international law of this concept of imminent threat, that gave them some shield, some cover, some sanction to do that which was illegal, to do that which was criminal. And we don't use, when we talk about the situation of the war on terror, we insufficiently use the words crime, we insufficiently use the words criminal, because what's happening in Mali now, and what's happening in Afghanistan now, what's happening in Syria now, with those same Islamists who apparently the West are fighting in the Sahel and North Africa, I can't give them enough weapons in Syria. What's happening in Syria now, that is criminal, and we need to raise our voices and speak of these crimes. So imminent threat is another term used in international law to sanction what ought to be unsanctionable. I want to talk about why it is there is a relative... how much time do I have left, Hamza? I've got to be quick. I want to talk briefly about why it is that there is a relative passivity in the UK, in France, in the United States, including in the left, the radical left, with regards to allowing that which ought not to be allowed in terms of the legalities and the illegalities of international law and its abuses. And you can't not talk about Eurocentricity. You can't not talk about white supremacy. And when I talk about Eurocentricity and white supremacy, I'm also talking about those of us who emanate from the global south, who have internalized concepts of human rights, which are concepts of liberalism. As if we, those of us who emanate from the global south, must be on some path, some stair step, some hierarchical ascendancy to full humanity, and full humanity is represented by the liberal institutions of the representative democracy West. And so when we reach their level, we are then fully human. That has been internalized so much by many of us, and also has been, obviously, is the prevailing ideology of the elite with power in the West and the lackeys who they put in place in the countries of the global south, that it's become normal. So it's seen as normal when the uncivilized global south, with their uncivilized authoritarian ways, etc., when there is perceived to be an issue created, and Sami touched upon this, created and exploded and expanded upon by the use of another proxy tool, which is the media, the only solution is a Western solution. Mali is an African solution. African solutions for African problems. Syrian solutions for Syrian problems. Afghanistan, these solutions for Afghan problems. But the way in which the human rights, the liberal human rights discourse prevails, it's not seen as such. So what do? I'm asking, when Sami asked me to speak, and I've got 2 minutes, 1.5 minutes left to speak, to conclude. Hamza asked me to always try to be solution-focused. And one of the solutions, maybe the solution, must be to have some kind of reconceptualization of the human rights struggle, to decolonize our minds and decolonize the human rights struggle. And in so doing, when you decolonize the human rights struggle, you look at international law, humanitarian intervention, and the ways in which the imperialist powers machinate to use those tools for their interest. You look at those in a different way. You look at those in a people-centered way, a people-centered human rights approach, and a human rights approach which then would look at the law in a different way and would ask different questions about from where does the law emanate, what are the sources of power behind the law, and so that law and people-centered human rights can be those those things which we activate in order to come to our own solutions. When I say our, I mean the global south, Africa, all struggling peoples who are struggling for radical solutions outside of the capitalist paradigm. I could say more. Thank you.
I didn't want to go last. It was a bit of an African bloodless coup that I arrived and said, Walid, you're going last, and so I hope the expectations are not too high. I'm going to just put a few teasers out there rather than an analysis, and then hopefully we pick it up later on in the questions. I want to talk about a concept that I have seen in West Africa and the Sahel and North Africa, and especially now in the case of Mali, and I call it diplomacy trading. It is something that's in the last French chapter of War on Terror has been very relevant in the sense that the coup was last March, There were months of speculations. Is it going to be an African-led intervention? Is it going to be French, American-led? Who's going to do it? But behind the scenes, until the very last minute, what was going on is a diplomatic lobbying of the French missions in all West African states to go and tell the people, guys, the African leaders and the African diplomats and whoever is involved, this is bigger than you. You can't do this because we're going to give you an example. Remember Liberia and Sierra Leone? This is a different story because Liberia and Sierra Leone, it was confined geographically within ECOWAS, within West Africa. But Mali is different, you know, because it's bordering North Africa and it's a bigger game. So you guys are going to sit this one out. You're not going to get involved. It is not the same stakes. And this kind of discourse, you hear it, I heard it myself from senior African Union diplomats, of course from French diplomats, UN diplomats and senior advisors or whatever they call themselves. So that is the idea that was promoted, even with the Algerians who, on the facade, they were against the intervention for a very long time, and then some of the diplomats, some of the decision makers came actually to believe it is not Sierra Leone and Liberia. It's a bigger game. We can't do it. The Sahara is so vast. We do not have the technology. We do not have the army, and it's just too much of a headache for us, the 15 countries of West Africa. So now it's a French-led intervention. But this is where the massive big lie goes back. They talk as if the Sierra Leone conflict was solved by ECOWAS or the Africans. Yes, the Nigerian Navy and the Nigerian Army got involved in the 90s. Yes, ECOWAS got involved at different stages during the decade-long civil war. But the finale of the Sierra Leone-Liberia conflict came by a British intervention. It was first to protect the British citizens, and then it was after to defend the United Nations peacekeepers because they could not defend themselves. Then they went there in May 2000, 13 years ago, and then they said, all right, we're going to expand the mission. And ECOWAS got involved later in stabilization and all this jazz, but it was a British-led, and it came 1 year or a few months after the famous speech of Tony Blair in Chicago, the ethos of intervention. It's a very funny choice of word, ethos. This is one part of, how diplomacy plays a big game in convincing or forceful convincing of West African leaders. Another point that I want to mention, just under the umbrella, again, of diplomacy trading, a big player, diplomatic player in the region that's been instrumentalized for especially Paris, Burkina Faso. We don't hear much, especially in, Britain and the US and Anglo-Saxon media. Burkina Faso, this landlocked country, what do they do? There are certain facts that I'm going to point to. Burkina Faso used to have one of the most promising young leaders in African modern history, Thomas Sankara, murdered, assassinated by his close associate who turned against him, who's currently now the president since '87, Mr. Blaise Compaoré. He's played the diplomatic card par excellence since '87. He's been involved selling the discourse of Paris to his West African brothers in every single conflict in West Africa. He's always there. And then, of course, at the back of it, he's got support. He's not a dictator. He's been there since '87. That's Mr. Compaoré. He's still in power, and his people talk very highly of him. Then the final part of the diplomatic trading is the bullying. And the bullying in relation to this very last intervention in Mali. I talked to diplomats and people in different parts of Africa, even French diplomats and Western diplomats speaking there, and different analysts, and they tell you Senegal and Ghana, for example, they're known to have the biggest, or at least the most trained, the most reliable armies. The two of them are very reluctant to get involved, but the French embassy in Dakar and Accra, they have put a lot of pressure on them to say, well, you are there, stand by, we need you. They're very reluctant, but this is what goes on behind the scenes. They're still not heavily involved, Ghana and Senegal, but on the way in. We don't know how long the French are staying there for. The second thing that I want to talk about is how these interventions, historically, in the post-colonial world, they promoted, the most thing that they promoted, the mistrust between West African and North African countries. And I'm going to give you just another factual teaser. Have we heard of the country in the recent days who killed, allegedly, the celebrity terrorists, Abu Zaid and Mukhtar al-Mukhtar? Chad. Chad, ladies and gentlemen, is not an ECOWAS country. Chad has absolutely no mandate. It's a Central African country. Yet it was the first in the French-led. It was the first African country who sent troops. The highest number of troops are Chadian, over 3,000. And some interesting facts about Chad as well. I mean, I spoke to people in Bamako, and they tell you the Malian army. They said, who are these? Why are they here? They're not, they're not ECOWAS. Come on, guys, we gotta do better when it comes to theater and lies. So no, look, the French, since the war between Chad and Libya in the mid-80s, and exactly since, if I remember well, since '86, the French have a permanent mission. I don't know what that means. It's not under any UN cover, or it's a permanent mission. Yeah, it's got some kind of UN rhetorical link into it, but it's ongoing, indefinite. N'Djamena, the capital of Chad, has got 1,000 troops permanently camped outside of N'Djamena airport. The president and the leadership of Chad, Mr. Idriss Déby, the president, has been there since 1990. He's took off the constitution any limits on the mandate, and he just cruises around with his mates in Paris. He's a regular visitor in that part of Europe, and yes, he's broke, and it's a good chance to bring him over. They know each other. The Chadians are well trained by the French. They've been together since '86, long time. So this goes back again to the mistrust. I'm going to give you another example of mistrust. You talk to people in Bamako, and they said, the Nigerians, part of the ECOWAS. They need to get some people from the ECOWAS at least. Nigeria is the biggest country in ECOWAS, and they said, all right, let's get some Nigerians. Nigerians are very reluctant. It takes always a bit of time for Nigerians to get their stuff together. This is what they say. Initially, they were going to send 500 troops. Then the French said, no, we'd rather keep the Chadians. And the rhetoric and the discourse of the French to the Malians was that you can't really trust the Nigerians because the military is not professional, because their counter-terrorism strategies is that when they go after Boko Haram in north and northeast Nigeria, what they do is that they arrest anybody who is above 15 years old, any male, torture them to death until they admit that they are Boko Haram, just teenagers, and they're not. And they said, you don't want to bring these guys over. They're African and it's ECOWAS and stuff, but they're not trained on counter-terrorism and fighting, rebellion groups up in the Sahara. So, no, they are ECOWAS, but leave them out there. Mistrust. What else? I'm limited on time. I know that some of us came here to talk about Algeria. Yeah. Algeria, and how, at the end, after all, the muscle flexing of the Algerians for 1 year and the media speculating, they are blocking, aren't they, the French intentions or the American intentions, whoever, to intervene, because, Algerians are saying no, they're not going to do with the French until the Algerians actually say yes. But we were all sitting and watching earlier this year, all in a sudden, the French decide to just intervene, and it was a bit of a slip of tongue from the French Minister of Exterior Affairs. He said, we informed, when he was asked by the media, has Algiers been kept in the loop? And he said, yeah, we informed our Algerian friends. This is as far as it went. The Algerians are now, the Algerian regime I'm talking about, is playing a different ball game when it comes to security, an absolute radical change. They officially had their first drone, the first American Predator drone flew over In Amenas officially for a few hours until the hostage crisis was over. But now the Algerians are sitting and watching very nervously the 100 military troops deployed southeast of Algeria, Niger, and there is an undefined number of American civilians, so we don't know how many people are actually in Niger. So Algeria, in terms of defense and geopolitics, it doesn't have the same might over Mali as it has done over the last 20 years, when it was always involved in, resolution and soothing conflicts and so on. It doesn't have the same kind of influence on Niger anymore, and Mauritania, its other neighbor to the southwest, is not very clear about its position towards the intervention. So, what is the Algerian regime thinking? As usual, opaque, nobody knows. But there's something certain: they are not in a good position, even more vulnerable. And since I got just 2 minutes, I want to finish on we've been talking about imperialism, anti-imperialism, intervention. Why do they happen? Why don't they happen? Should we invite people? Should we not invite people? And I know some of us, the word anti-imperialism doesn't go down well. Anti-imperialism, people get tagged with a bunch of hippies, flower power type of thing. And for me, it is not a question of, using different type of lexicon. It is just a matter of post-colonial self-determination, neo-self-determination, whatever you want to call it. The Africans need African solutions for themselves, not Paris or London or Washington to go around and tell them, we bring the Chadians from here. No, don't trust them, Nigerians, Senegalese, come over, wait. This is not what the global South needs. The final note, and I'm trying to keep it positive, as the chair asked me. There is a bit of in the struggle of neo-self-determination, not to say anti-imperialism. There are a lot of divisions between us now. Us who are not happy about the situation, because you get a lot of discourse. People saying, Gaddafi was not really a good man, or Saddam was not really a good man, but, Gbagbo was not really a good man. We know all of this, but I'm talking about anti-imperialist activists. But they say, no, we support this kind of regimes because we have to look at the big picture, internationalism of the global South. So, regardless if, Mugabe is a bit off his mind and whatever, but we got to support them. We got to support. This is the very wrong attitude. Two wrongs do not make a right. To support the Algerian regime and be apologetic for a criminal, illegitimate regime just out of fear of imperialism. This is what invites imperialism. Fragile, illegitimate regimes, when things go wrong, the people do not go behind them, or at least a big chunk of people do not go behind them. This is self-inviting to imperialism. The cronies there are the ones who, in Algeria, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Ivory Coast, and elsewhere in the Middle East, those type of elites are the most imperialist when it comes to Africa. They are the ones, even if they play the games of the facade, rhetorically saying we are against intervention, like the Algerians like to say, but at the end of the day, their social contracts with their people, the lack of the institutions, this is what makes them very fragile, very vulnerable, and this is what allows Paris to, after 1 year of Algerians jumping over their whatever, and there's last minute they say, we're flying over, open your airspace and shut up. This is not the good attitude. We have, if we are talking about new ways of self-determinations for the global South, then we need to get over those divides, over, Gaddafi or Mugabe or who. Two wrongs do not justify anything. Two wrongs do not make a right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very insightful contribution. I think we should spend more time, a few minutes, to tackle very important points. I promise you'll have more time for questions and answers. Explo, we are presented with this dichotomy that in one hand, we can let the Islamist terrorists commit their crimes, flogging bodies and cutting hands and destroying world heritage, or on the other hand, we welcome the imperialist intervention that are supposed to liberate us. So what are we supposed to reply to those people who say that Africans couldn't do it for themselves, that we needed an urgent short solution to the problem?
Clearly, this is not the last experience we are going to have, and this is not a first experience. The important thing for us is how to build solid democracy within our people. The fact is that if our people are organized at the grassroots well, and money is not diverted into corrupt regimes which do not build the armed force defense, there is no way the Islamist militias or even the foreign commands will come in. So this will have to be a very important lesson, that we have to concentrate in building grassroots-based democracy. We have to concentrate in putting together our own militias at the grassroots level. That will protect the land against the invasion or protect against the supposed terrorists coming in. And it will also bring Africa together so that we will be able to establish the African High Command that Nkrumah and others proposed, and we will not need AFRICOM. So the solution is still home-based. The African forces these days come to countries like the US, enroll in their armed forces, they take them to Iraq and other places, and they are able to fight. So it is possible for them to be also to control their own countries if they are properly organized. So the first that it is the weakness of those regimes and the fact that these regimes are not rooted in their populations, which made it possible in the first place for the supposed terrorists to sneak in. So if we have well-organized, grassroots-based, democratic societies, there is no way in which those forces can come in. You take Tanzania, which had the Ujamaa system under Nyerere. Anybody who's been to Tanzania will tell you it is difficult to sneak into Tanzania and hide yourself because Nyerere has organized that country in such a way. And if the way in which Tanzania has been organized, if we are organized continent-wide that way, it will not be possible for those forces to intervene.
Sami, I would like to get your opinion on Samir Amin's recent controversial position on the French intervention. Samir Amin, a tireless defender of the global South and an anti-imperialist par excellence, said that he is, by principle, opposed to any Western intervention in the countries of the global South. But for him, the French intervention this time is the exception. So according to him, the French intervened to oppose the US plan of creating an Islamic Sahelistan in the region that will include Algeria, Niger, Mali, and Mauritania. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I did read Samir Amin's article, and to tell you the truth, I was disappointed by his conclusions on Mali, and I don't think he does succeed in making the case for a so-called exception. I think he fundamentally misses the point that France is a major colonial power, was in Africa, that it has enormous strategic interests in Africa, and their intervention in Mali is part and parcel of that picture rather than some exceptional circumstance that led the French politicians to say, let's just go and help out the people of Mali against the Islamic extremists. I think it's time also to study closely the links between the former colonial powers and these Islamic organizations. And I used the word Islamic in brackets. I think these are movements that, by and large, have been counter-revolutionary. They've been against social rights for women, for children. Generally in society, they have played a reactionary role, and the links between them and these colonial powers dates back to, in the case of Saudi Arabia, to the 1920s, and in the case of the rest of the Middle East, post-World War II, they have started building close links with sections of even the moderates of them, like the Muslim Brotherhood. As to the violent takfiri type who would kill any Muslim who does not support their theses or theories or the way they want to oppress women and so on. The links between these organizations and the imperialist powers are extremely close, and that, I think, goes for North Africa as well. Some of the leaders of the armed groups in Libya, for example, were well-known former Guantanamo Bay prisoners released by the United States, handed over to Gaddafi. Gaddafi released them after about a year or so, and it was they who initially led the armed groups in Libya, opening the door for NATO intervention. In the context of Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra is an al-Qaeda affiliated type organization, terrorists. They date back some of their fighters to the war in Afghanistan against Soviet intervention, and the links between the United States, the CIA, Saudi money, Gulf money, and these organizations is well documented. There is also some terrorist activity from within Iraq into Syria. I mean, there is now enough evidence not only to back up this historic link between the most reactionary forces in society, including these armed groups, and other sections of reaction and the imperialists. And I think Samir Amin has missed on a vital link between imperialists and these organizations.
Kevin, do you want to comment on this?
I was nodding my head vigorously because one cannot disagree with the way in which our brother Sami here has directed our attention to the misguided separation of the interests of French imperialism and United States or British Anglo-Saxon imperialism. Imperialism is imperialism, just like mafia bosses are mafia bosses, and they fall out from time to time. They collaborate from time to time. they have similar interests, and those interests are never they never coincide for any long period of time with the interests of those who they seek to extort. And I think what we have to also do, I was pleased to hear my brother Sami here talk about looking into the connections between so-called Islamist organizations and militants and the colonial powers. When I spoke earlier, I spoke about aspects of law and legality and international law. And one would have thought that we'd be hearing more about the International Criminal Court and the use of the structures and the sanctions of the International Criminal Court in relation to what is going on or has gone on in the recent past in North Africa. Whether we're talking about Mali, we could stretch it back and talk about Libya, post-Gaddafi, and presently with the ethnic cleansing, for example. But there are geostrategic power reasons why we will not... there are geostrategic power reasons why we will not have that push towards sanction by use of the International Criminal Court. We know, because to do so would be to expose those links which my brother Sami just mentioned with regards to the colonial powers and the Islamists. To do so would show the ways in which reactionary, conservative, authoritarian, anti-democratization forces are used by the West as proxies for their own interests. My brother Nani Kofi has talked about proxy war, and it's a proxy war in all sorts of areas. It's a proxy war in terms of perceptions, conceptualizations, and also there's a proxy war in terms of the struggle and understanding of the connection between human rights and the law, and the recent use in the past decade or so, certainly since 2001, if not previously, but certainly since 2001, the use of human rights, Western liberal ideology as a fig leaf for the West to secure its interests. And what's worse, you have your human rights watchers, you have your Amnesty Internationals, you have your essentially Western, white, middle-class human rights organizations who, because they have internalized and normalized this conceptualization of top-down human rights as just being normal, then we have what essentially is a thinly veiled 21st century mission civilisatrice, or white man's burden.
Let's come back to Algeria, Walid. Many people were confused with the ambiguous position of Algeria towards the French intervention in Mali. At first, Algeria was pushing for a diplomatic solution, and then it opened its airspace unconditionally for the French planes. So we had many different scenarios, even contradictory. So we had the Dan Glazebrook, who published an article in Counterpunch, drawing some parallels between Libya and Algeria, and saying that the real motif behind the French intervention in Mali was to destabilize Algeria because of its resource nationalism. On the other hand, we have the Jeremy Keenan scenario, which accuses the Algerian security services of masterminding the Ain Amenas hostage crisis to signal that it has a hegemony in the region and to justify the war on terror. So what do you think about these scenarios?
It's a difficult one, but the Algerian regime is the one that is destabilizing Algeria the most. It is the leading in having the country very vulnerable, as I just earlier, to imperialist maneuvers and interventions south of its border. Yes, there was a lot of speculations. How come the Algerians opened up their airspace unconditionally and definitely? We don't know how long and how many planes are flying over the Sahara. But the real question is not why and how come and whether there was a deal between Paris and and Algiers, you guys open up your space and we'll give you a bit more of breathing space. At the end of the day, you are an embattled regime and you need a bit of international diplomatic support. And this kind of message, between Algiers, Washington, Paris, and London has, it's a classic one. We know that the West tells Algiers they know off the record that it is a completely undemocratic, backwards, and illegitimate regime, but they cannot afford the instability in the region, the same old discourse that they used in the past. So the move was not done in consultation with Algiers, I believe. It was a forced one. They took a decision, and Algiers just simply had to say yes.
So do you think that the Western powers would like to destabilize Algeria? What about the question of resource nationalism?
Look, I have not come across in history, empires or countries or groups of people and tribes who have not sought their own interests. I'm going to be a bit controversial. I do not, in a way. I condemn the double discourse of the West. But I'm not surprised at all that the West goes after its own interests. It is for the Africans, it is for the global South to reinforce themselves and fight imperialism from inside. I mean, you can't. What do we? I mean, what else do we expect? I know this is a bit of a neoliberal, pragmatic discourse, and but we've seen this over and over. We're going to see it again, and it's not surprising.
Okay, let's take questions from the audience. 2 or 3.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say that I'm a little bit confused because one word that we heard quite often is imperialism. And to be honest, I didn't come tonight. Actually, I wasn't expecting to hear this word as much as tonight. It's not a word that I use personally, even though I'm a believer that yes, it does still exist and everything. And I will explain why, and then I will ask my question. Where is the responsibility of the African unity? Where is the responsibility of Mali as a country? I mean, why is it that we are sitting here worrying that the French are gone to Mali because they have interest in Mali? They fear that the Chinese will get to Africa before them. As a matter of fact, between brackets, I don't think the Chinese are yet really interested as people want to, as newspapers want to tell us. Chinese are not yet interested in Africa because, as a matter of fact, of the type of countries, the type of societies, I even say, the type of people that there is in Africa. So Chinese are not really interested in investing in Africa. However, why are we surprised? Okay, I mean, I do not think that I asked to speak, but actually serve for you to laugh at what I'm saying. Now we can discuss it later on, but I'd like to finish what I'm saying. Thank you, sir.
Can you be a little bit brief, please?
I need to get to what I heard because I need to clarify my ideas as well. Do we know that, for example, the French, yes, maybe they decided to go to Mali quickly, informed as a matter of Algeria, as a matter of fact, informed Algeria very late, just like Algeria actually informed the rest of the world, after it has taken the decision to intervene in Aminas. So I see this as not a real problem, but just, again, politics. Countries have the right to do things whenever they feel like it, so that's not really a problem. But
can you get to your question?
Do we know that when France went to Mali, the popularity of Hollande was actually dropping? Okay, so Hollande went to Mali, first of all, to please the French, to show the French that France, with all its economic problems, France still exists, France still has a say in the world, and France can actually do like Britain and the United States did when they intervened in other places. So what I would like to ask all of you is, if instead of us, you had in front of you the children, the Malian children, the Malian people of all the little towns and the little villages, even in Bamako as a matter of fact, where Islamists have succeeded in creating an atmosphere of fear on a daily basis, where people couldn't do what they need to do on a daily basis. They couldn't go out, they couldn't go to school, they couldn't, girls had to wear
Okay.
scarves. So
We'll get your point. Yeah, we'll go your point.
What would you say to them? Would you say to them, it is imperialism? It is a part of democracy? What would you say to them?
Yes, I agree with everything the speaker said. Now I'm going to pose a question that's been in my mind even before today. What does the intervention in Mali mean for the global war on terror as a long-term Western strategy? I'll explain what I mean by the question. Because most of us here are old enough to remember that the original concept, war on terror, was a specifically neoconservative proposal first, which was then adopted by the Bush regime. And it was a sharp break with previous imperialist strategies for dominating the global south. Because it created enemies who previously weren't enemies. It destabilized large parts of the world intentionally in the name of democracy. But in order to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, a permanent war, a battlefield could be anywhere and everywhere. Any resistance could be labeled terrorism, and was, and so on. This was not accepted universally by all imperialist interests, especially the social democratic side of the European elites. It was accepted conditionally in the case of Iraq, but not universally. Now we've got France, Socialist Party, going even further. A small band of invading Islamist groups who have no internal support being treated as if it were a global threat to justify a military invasion which almost guarantees permanent dependence of the Mali regime on Western forces and permanent military conflict. Perhaps not with the Islamists, because they'll escape, perhaps with the Tuaregs or others. So, I mean, how do we interpret this as perhaps as a turning point? Perhaps, as someone said, France is now desperate, or the whole West is desperate, because of China. Here, I totally disagree. I mean, you're factually wrong. China is by far the single largest investor in Africa, and now a serious rival to the Western imperialist interest. So does that explain now why the social democracy has adopted the war on terror?
Yeah. Can we? Okay, you go, Kofi.
I wish we had put this question to just an ordinary peasant in the streets of Ghana about whether China is interested in investing. In fact, I couldn't help laughing, and I'm very serious about that. Because it's important for us to visit facts. Now, Chinese are taking over even the illegal mining from illegal miners in Ghana, using guns and things in villages. That is the reality on the African continent, despite how nasty the African people may look. And so the facts for any intellectual that Chinese investment in Africa is increasing day in, day out. So for anybody to say that Chinese are not interested in investing because of the type of people in Africa, I will always laugh when I hear that. What is the responsibility of African unity? Again, the reason why I will blame the West in this is this. Look, Africa is not just made up of all those type of people who want to be corrupt, unpatriotic, and so on. Africa is made up also of various patriotic forces. The history, again, of the African continent is that any time a patriotic force emerges, it is the West which has intervened and made sure that that patriotic force is killed. For example, let me take Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Lumumba, who emerged from the All Africa People's Conferences as one of the most patriotic African leaders. He was murdered, and Mobutu, a very corrupt element, with assistance of the West, replaced him. That is why we have societies which people in the society cannot rise on the side of the government. It is that kind of intervention that has made Africa the way it is. And that is why I was arguing that if we will organize grassroots democracy, of the patriotic forces, and that the West will not be paying people huge sums of money, like was paid to police and military officers to overthrow Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, the Musa Traore to overthrow Modibo Keita in Mali, where we are having the problem today. We would have been able to build the African High Command that Nkrumah called for, and that this kind of intervention would not even have needed the West, because Africa is not made up of subhumans.
I just want to pick up on a point that the lady mentioned here, and I do agree that the Africans should take responsibility, and some of them have tried. Most of them ended up assassinated or in exile. And it is not to put the finger of blame always on the West and on imperialism. This is, the struggle now is for the masses, for the Africans, to get rid of their African corrupt lackeys, their masters, and then the neo-slaves of the ex-colonies. This is the reality now, and this is the struggle. It's between Africans and their leadership to get over. So I agree in this sense. You asked also a question about what is to be done, you know, in a place like Mali, how Mali does not take responsibility. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote of how the institutions, from the United Nations down to regional blocs, down to the African Union, down to the Malian government, when it comes to viewing how functioning was the Malian democracy was up until the 22nd of March last year, the date of the coup. I mean, people, they portrayed Mali, and I've seen this, and I've said this over and over, as a working democracy. People actually believed it. You know, down in the streets in Bamako and elsewhere in the country, people were telling me, we are a democracy. That was before the coup. That was before the last rebellion. And not a long time ago, I spoke with a senior advisor of Ban Ki-moon, the United Nations Secretary General, who specializes in African affairs. And he told me a few weeks before the coup, the African Union and the international community were considering to give the prize of good governance to the overthrown president, Amadou Touré, ATT, the guy who was overthrown. A few weeks before, everything went wrong. Still, they did not see it coming, and I'm talking about institutions. This is people sitting in Addis Ababa, the African Union, and people sitting in Dakar, in the UN siege, and people sitting in New York. They really believed, or delusioned themselves to believe, that it is. So the Mo Ibrahim Foundation Governance Prize goes for Mr. ATT. A few weeks later, the country is divided and everything is wrong. So this is the tragedy of Africa, to have someone like ATT for 20 years who did the classic thing of coming as a military guy. He did a coup, and then he just disappeared behind the scenes for a decade or so, and then he came back in a shiny suit and he said, I'm a civilian president, and he's been in power since. One thing that you need to know about Mali and the corruption of ATT that everybody was clapping in the West was that in Mali you can buy ranks in the military, in the army, colonel, lieutenant colonel, general, I don't know what. There is a menu, like in the restaurants. You can actually be just, a really a random guy on the streets, physically you don't look very fresh, but you got some cash, you can become a colonel. And this is the type of democracy that existed in Mali, and this is what needs to be overthrown. How to do it, I agree with you, it's very hard. I don't have the answer.
So Sami, we have this problem. So we have weak lackeys, weak government, and we have terrorists killing people, flogging bodies, cutting hands. So people are, I think, entitled to say we need a short-term solution. We need something. We need to react. So what?
Yes, I think this is an important question, and And it's not an easy one to answer. The same question was raised in the context of Iraq. What do you tell Iraqi children threatened by Saddam's chemical weapons? What do you tell the children of Libya with Gaddafi threatening to move from neighborhood to neighborhood to kill his own people? What do you tell the children of Syria today in the face of Bashar's regime? To my mind, and I think for the people who have those children, the threat to these children is not short-term. It is short-term and long-term. So unless you take the short, medium, and long-term into account, you will have more children getting killed than being killed today. So the Islamists who threatened the children, who threatened some of the children of Mali, is only part of the threat to those children. And unless, I know you don't like the word imperialism, let's use the word post-colonial powers, the big powers, okay? If you're happy with that, I'm happy with it too. These big powers, once they intervene, then the threat to those children, the threats to the fabric, social fabric of those societies becomes undermined. They undermine these interventions and occupations by these big powers tend to undermine social fabrics, tend to undermine social cohesion, create forces which are at even greater loggerheads than before. They create resistance to occupation as well as forces which ally themselves to the foreign interventionists, creating the grounds for greater civil wars. The threat to our children increases exponentially 100 times over. So you have to appeal to your humanity and compassion not on the basis of a couple of headlines suddenly in the French newspapers that the children of Mali are threatened. The children across the third world are threatened daily. Millions of people die of hunger. Millions of children are dying of disease and hunger because of this exploitation of the big powers and the local reactionaries. I do not forget, on the contrary, the big powers cannot do a thing without these local corrupt regimes, corrupt classes, exploitative classes, Islamic terrorists, and so on. Unless you integrate that picture, you will not help the children of the world. Even the children of Britain are suffering because of these wars. The children in the United States, millions of them, by the way, go hungry in the United States if you look at the social and economic statistics of the United States. And partly because of foreign intervention, all the children of the world are suffering.
Just to be brief about what we might say to children, and putting the question back, what we might say to the children of Saudi Arabia, or the children of Bahrain, or the children of Qatar, or indeed those children in Latin America in the 70s and 80s when the US sponsored terrorism, Operation Condor. Argentinian children had their parents dropped out of planes. So we could have lots of discussions about what we might say about children, but my fellow brothers on the panel have addressed sufficiently that which the female speaker just raised. Mali has also highlighted another law, the law of unintended consequences. And the law of unintended consequences can work both ways. The West will throw up their hands and say, "Oh, this is terrible. What's going on? We've intervened, but we didn't realise it was going to get so madly, crazily out of control." Or the law of unintended consequences could be honestly could be honestly interpreted as wholly and completely intended. Now, our comrade who spoke just now with regards to the war on terror going forward, well, you know, war is terror, so terror on terror, you know, doesn't make sense really. In terms of in terms of intended or unintended consequences, well, imperialism, and I like that word imperialism. I don't like imperialism, but I like the word imperialism because it speaks to truth. Moving on. With regards to the intended or unintended consequences of these wars, these proxy wars, imperialism has a range of options. Sometimes it will work with a destabilized government before they can just boot it off the ledge, as they want to do with Syria, as they did do with Libya. Sometimes they will use their proxy militants to a greater extent than they would otherwise do. But let's not forget also the blowback that comes to Western citizens, you and I. You've had well, we haven't, not yet in the UK, but it's coming. We've had an act enacted by Obama now, which gives him discretion to kill US citizens without any, extrajudicial killing, without any judicial process or sanction. Obviously, he could already do that with regards to us plebs who are foreigners and are not United States citizens. But the unintended consequences also includes that when you have these wars in which it's difficult to separate combatants from non-combatants, necessarily you're going to have human rights violations committed by our governments. Necessarily. Because you cannot distinguish a combatant from a non-combatant. Any military strategist would tell you it's nonsense to think that the French can come in, crush the so-called Islamist militants in Mali, go out, and then leave the instability which existed before. So the final point I'd make, the unintended consequences are totally intended, but even if they are unintended, Western military imperialism has strategies to try to take advantage of that as well.
Let's take another round of questions. You. Can you raise your voice? Yeah.
Well, it's clear that Western corporations are not accountable to Western citizens, and at least not directly, and definitely not for what they do overseas. And it's also clear that Western governments are colluding and collaborating with these Western corporations and creating conditions that facilitate their exploitation of third world countries. And so, as a Westerner, the question is, what can I do in the West to create change? And the reality is I cannot do much, at least not in the West. If I try to work in institutions that to enable that change, I'll find that I'll be brought to conformity, or I will be excluded from these institutions if I do not share the same views as the political superstructure and the industries and corporations. And so by exclusion, isn't the only option left the armed struggle in third world countries?
Okay. First of all, I'd like to start with an observation which will lead to my question.
Maria, can you raise your voice?
Oh, yes. So I'd like to start with an observation which will lead to my question. What I feel perhaps we haven't spent enough time focusing on is France-Afrique, which is basically the strategy that France has been leading for the last 50 years, since 1960 at the dawn of the decolonization of Africa, in terms of preserving its economic interests through military strategy. And that involves military bases throughout Africa, a force of up to 10,000 soldiers in Africa, be it through permanent bases or through opérations extérieures, as they call them, through different military treaties that they have been signing with up to 15 countries. So France's intervention in Africa is absolutely not new. It's been going on for the last 15 years, and they've, in fact, the number of interventions that are known and well documented are around 50. That's a huge number. So then my question is around the specificity of the Mali case. and the fact that what we're now seeing is France's intervention in the context of something relatively new, which is the Islamist threat. And to me, that signals something quite new in the region. And we've also spoken of imperialism as this kind of homogenic bloc. So this is perhaps where my challenge comes in, which leads to my question. To what extent, perhaps, do we think that the Islamist threat that is being used currently may be signaling an increasingly competitive landscape for this homogenic imperialist bloc in terms of their influence in Africa? Has France had too much monopoly so far? Is the United States getting worried that it doesn't have enough grip on Africa, especially in the context of a rise in China? And how does that play in? Are these being manipulated? That's my direct question. Are these Islamic?
Well, it's a follow-up of the current question, and I would like us to focus on methodology and whether this, as she said, imperialism, French imperialism, has been going on since the independence of most of African countries. And is it still strategic for the African narrative, and with regard to the type of development necessary for Africa, to still speak about white supremacism, imperialism, and so on? Maybe now it's time to stop using a language which makes sound the African as victim of a fate, and start to develop a new language in which the first necessity would be to have a clear vision. And this is what seems to be missing since 60 years. There is still no vision for the African development. African solution for Africa, yes, but how? And it seems that it's still difficult to be formulated.
Another question.
I think it's very dangerous to say that the African issues, whatever, are local issues. As much as I don't like the international intervention, I still think that the issue is not African issue. It is imperialism, I agree with that, but it is the war of the good against the bad, really. Because where does this imperialism come from? It comes from large organizations. They're trying to protect their interests and everything. So basically, you can't say just the Africans have to think about that. Europeans, for example, Americans, whoever it is, in their own countries, they need to also be aware of that. They need to know that the children who are dying in Africa, you don't just throw comic relief and then send some money there and just fool the world into thinking that Africa is a very poor continent. It's a very rich continent, that's why we have lots of trouble. And people need to be aware that it's not just their problem and we just go have the military intervention, whatever. But we need to elect the right governments here. We need to speak out against what they do, because regardless of who's governing, whether it's Labour, whether it's Lib Democrats, whether it's the Conservatives, the message is the same. We will protect the rich and the poor pay for it.
Okay. Sami, can you answer the question of, as a Westerner, what can we do? And pick on the last question, which is we don't need to think about the African problems as local problems. I think this is maybe an internationalist perspective you're talking about.
Okay.
Just a small comment. If you please draw for me now the imperialism map, I'll be waiting.
Yeah, do you have half an hour?
Because with the whole Russia coming in and China coming in and the US coming in,
Sure.
there is clear understanding. For example, Britain is very careful not to go into Algeria because it's like, oh, it's a French. No, we're independent from France.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. No, please.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, I'll comment on two issues. What can we do here in the West, and also the question of imperialism, which relates, I think, to something you said in the back as well about the competition between the big powers and possible manipulation of Islamic movements, if I understood you correctly, that is. On the issue of what can we do here, for me, I'm an internationalist. By many definitions, including ideologically, I tend to go for internationalism as something really fundamental to what I stand for, that across the globe we have common interests and these interests collide with, to put it in popular language, with greed and the domination of peoples of the world by the transnational corporations that are sucking the blood out of our planet in general, destroying our environment, destroying much of the third world, and exploiting people here or in the United States and so on. So there is a common interest between what goes on in the third world or in the global south and here in the West. Britain has spent countless billions on war. And they have spent countless millions paying the bankers for the mess they brought onto the British economy. And where do these countless billions are sucked out of? Two sources: the third world, further exploitation of the resources, and the British people themselves, clawing back on social services and income support and housing for the poor and so on. The way they go on about most British people, they treat them like cannon fodder, economically speaking. So there is a common interest to be anti-war and to be anti-interventionist across the globe, including people in the West. And there's a lot we can do here in terms of campaigning, in terms of solidarity work with the struggle of the peoples of the region. In terms of what the word imperialism, I used it as a conceptual as well as a real term, but not to imply that imperialism is a unified monolithic force. By no means. On the contrary, one of the most important cornerstones of imperialism is the collision between the imperialist powers. What was World War I about? What was World War II mostly about? So there is inbuilt competition between the big powers. Even amongst the Western powers, there is contradictions between the United States and the European powers, between European powers, the United States and Japan, and now obviously with Russia and with China, as we see in Africa so clearly, and parts of the Middle East, by the way. So in terms of these powers competing with each other, they use various contradictions that exist in these societies. Some of these contradictions are based on ethnic differences. Some are based on religious differences. Some are based on sectarian differences. Egypt has 10 million Coptic Christians. So if any outside powers want to have a finger in the pie in Egypt, they have to work on this difference. Coptic versus, in fact, Mubarak's regime was implicated, and there's enough evidence to that in the Egyptian courts, implicated in trying to blow up churches in Egypt. To stir tensions between the Christians of Egypt and the Muslims. And similarly in Iraq, I know for sure that Christian leaders were captured and killed by pro-US forces in Iraq. If you go and ask the leading Christian clergy of Syria and Lebanon, they say categorically, and Iraq, they say categorically, Israel and the West want us, the Christians of the Middle East, to leave our homeland. They are on the record in their overwhelming majority, the top leading Christian clergy. Why don't they get reported here in London? When it suits them, they would, but when it doesn't suit, there is intense intervention in terms of the ethnic and religious map of the region, and divide and rule is an old colonial policy that is being pursued today with the use of the most advanced computerized technologies, money, interventions of a different type. It's not only military. The occupation of Iraq has allowed the United States to enter the fabric of Iraqi society. That's why they have the biggest embassy in the world in Baghdad. And I know for sure how they manipulate the political forces, including the so-called Takfiri Islamists who target other Muslims or target Christians and so on. So there is a lot of manipulation there as well. I don't want to take too much time, but I should stop.
Walid, on the question of France-Afrique and the invention of a new language.
Yeah. I'm going to start very quickly with the what can we do in the West? Certainly not tell Africans what to do. That's, I think, the milestone. Second, I do not see any alternative or anything to be done in Africa. Rather, here, holding governments accountable, holding the people that we vote for. It's a very simple message, but when people try to transcend that message, this is where they started meddling, often with good intentions. Not often, sorry, not too often with the good intentions, but some people do want to get involved. It doesn't work. The thing that we can do in the West is holding governments and people accountable. Going back to the question of, and this takes us back straight to France-Afrique, the people who voted for François Hollande. You know, there was all the talk about France-Afrique is over, we're turning the page, it's not relevant anymore, we're going to restructure our relationship with our ex-French colonies in Africa. There is now definitely neo-France-Afrique, and I can give one very concrete example of this. Back, what was it, March 2011, remember, you know, we're all on the top of the news, on the BBC, everywhere in mainstream media hearing about Gbagbo versus Ouattara. We all remember this, right? Ivory Coast, the end of the Civil War, how the French intervened, and that was for them the kind of last chapter of France-Afrique. What happened actually in Ivory Coast at the time? Gbagbo is not to defend. Gbagbo is not a good guy. Ouattara is not that much better. Why? The imperialist powers, the West was not comfortable with with Gbagbo, because he, as bad as he was, he had a vision for reforming the cacao. How do you say cacao in French? Cocoa. Yeah, cocoa. Yeah. He was trying to give farmers more power because they are extremely exploited. And it is the biggest producer of cocoa, whatever it's called. Yeah, cocoa in the world, the biggest producer, the biggest exporter. Now, we have another president in Ivory Coast, Alassane Ouattara. The France-Afrique continues through other models. And one example of this is the stepson of Mr. Ouattara that we do not hear about. The first lady of Alassane Ouattara is another French fly businesswoman, Dominique Ouattara, actually born and raised in my hometown, Constantine. She's Pied Noir French. Her son, from another marriage, Loïc Folleroux, if you're interested in Ivory Coast, you should put down that name. He controls the industry. So the politicians, the diplomats, they take a step away. So we're not doing the France-Afrique. The businessman and the son of the first lady, Mr. Loïc, comes in, you know, a young guy from France. He comes in, he's running the show for the big chocolate and whatever dairy companies in Europe. Going back to another very crucial question about the France-Afrique. When politicians come and they try in the West to get voted on new ideas, on new proposals for foreign policy, what we often forget about is that foreign policy is not decided necessarily by cabinet ministers. We forget that diplomats and the gurus of foreign policy, those advisors, academics, analysts, security wanks, excuse my French, these people they do not change. You know, civil servants, they're there for life, you know. The people who advise François Hollande to intervene in Mali are the same people who advise Sarkozy to intervene in Ivory Coast. And this is, so the politicians are the facade, but the system is rotten. You get an elite in Paris, you know, a bunch of academics, a bunch of experts, and they are there for life. The diplomats, and the mentality does not change. People can run on different messages. The last question on...
Sorry, I think you
Many.
misunderstood my question. Just a really quick one. I didn't... France-Afrique is here to stay, no matter what, what government, socialist or not. It's always been the case. That's not my question. My question is, do you feel, because of now the difference in terms of the justification used for intervention, which is now the Islamist threat, which in the last 50 years France has not used, does that signal a change in terms of the competitive landscape of the different powers?
That was my question.
Yeah, well, I'm going to very briefly. The question of Islamism in West Africa, we think it is new. If you go back to the 80s, there were very radical Islamist groups operating in Nigeria and in Cameroon, and they have done absolutely mad things. I mean, there were some kind of Islamist doctrines that if you ride a bicycle, for example, it's a kind of equivalence. This is how Boko Haram came. And then this is how all these people extended up to Mali, and they are now in Mauritania. For example, if you wear sunglasses because it's Western, people were getting shot in early 80s in Nigeria. If you ride a bike, you get shot. It is being used. It's not new. It is now a new excuse, and at the time there was a different framework to intervene and meddle with the affairs of Africa. Now it kind of fits with the narrative since 2011. The very last thing on the question of the language, I agree with you. The lexicon needs to change in the sense that I'm very against the idea of victimization. It is self-destructive. It never takes you forward. It does not empower the people. This is why I was trying to say before, I mean, this is my idea just on the fly, neo-self-determination. This is what we need in Africa.
Let's take another round of questions.
Africa doesn't have a vision.
We'll reply later.
Okay, I think we need to get clear on what we mean by democracy and what we don't mean by democracy, and the relation of democracy to imperialism. Does imperialism fear democracy? Well, it fears the power of the people, but do the British imperialists fear the parliamentary democratic system that exists in this country? I don't think so. Do the U.S. imperialists fear the parliamentary democratic system that exists there? I don't think so. As long as power and wealth is divided into a handful of rich exploiters that control and dominate the economy, they are going to use that to control and dominate the political process. And the democratic system you have is going to serve that class. That's the basic essence of what's going on in this society. And look, this is important because the left has been confused and wrong about this for a long time. In the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, the whole continent was run with a bunch of military dictatorships. And the left said, basically, the fight for democracy equals the fight against imperialism. What do you have 30 years later? The U.S. imperialists go in, they tolerate, they foster, they manipulate and shape the rise of a bunch of parliamentary democracies. So you have free and fair elections, so-called, throughout the continent. Who's running the continent? U.S. imperialism. I'll ask the audience this. What was the most democratic country in the mid and late 1990s? South Africa, okay? The overthrow of the apartheid system, the whole left thought, look, those 10% of the white settlers that used to dominate everything, now the black masses are going to get the vote, they're going to use it, and they're going to change the whole country. What happened? We got Marikana. As long as these imperialists, if you're not overthrowing them, if you're not giving land to the peasants, if you're not bringing the women into power, if you're not revolutionizing the power relations of society, then you are not going to be able to bring the masses into actually running the thing.
Yeah, this is just a very quick question. I think, we could all agree that African issues should be for African people. But what then are we to make of the fact that Al Jazeera, for example, produced quite a lot of footage during the recent French invasion of Mali of people actually cheering French troops in the streets and apparently welcoming them? I mean, that to me seems a puzzle which so far the platform haven't solved. Thank you.
I'll keep it very quick as well. If I take it back to Algeria again, how do we learn from history, like what's been happening in Iraq? If you are opposing the regime, but you're anti-interventionist, what's the way forward? As Wendy was saying earlier, two wrongs don't actually make a right. So Algerians are a bit in a limbo of how actually what do we do?
Do you want to go on the first question about bourgeois democracy and imperialism?
The earlier question, Africa doesn't have a vision.
Okay.
Yes. It's alleged that Africa doesn't have a vision, and that is the problem, and that we should stop presenting ourselves as victims. Maybe I've been listening to a different panel. Actually, I have not had the impression that Africa has been presented as a victim, but I've followed the discussion that Africa has been presented as a fighting force, and that in this fight, there is the attempt to sabotage that advancement. The one thing I would say is that in post-colonial Africa, I'll say that there are competition of visions. And we have the vision of those who want to advance the interests of society and the vision of those who want to collaborate to keep Africa in the situation in which it is. And we have said in this discussion that without certain home domestic presence of collaborators, there is no way an external force will be able to do damage within any territory. So for those who are not aware, I will not talk about it, but I'll give a number of initiatives from Africa. The resolutions of the All Africa People's Conferences, also the African alternative to the orthodox structural adjustment programs, July 1989. Those two should be looked at, and the ongoing struggle to ensure that the contents of these vision-guided papers are advanced, whilst there is also a struggle to always sabotage them, sabotage these domestically imaged plans. So that is what I'll say in reply.
My question was on the methodology, on the language we use, and actually it was intended to give you...
Yeah, the methodology question has been answered. That's,
and this language,
that
as blaming the law is not meant to bring justice. The law is meant to bring order. Lawyers are meant to bring justice.
That question has been answered by Walid, and I'm responding to... Hello. You also said that the problem is that Africa... No, you said there's no vision. If it was tape recorded, I'm sure other people... If you didn't say that, they'll say, okay. If you didn't say that, then let's leave it at that. So you didn't say that. So that's okay. Since you didn't say that, that's okay. I heard it wrongly. But other people also heard it. Okay, on the question of what sort of democracy, the only kind of democracy which will be able to advance a people's interest is the one which is rooted on the masses of the people who toil and produce what runs society. Because then there will be a unity between the force that produces and the force that directs society.
Okay. Sami Ramadani, can you go and comment on Al Jazeera?
Al Jazeera, and a bit on the link between democracy and imperialism. I think that's quite an important question. On Al Jazeera, I think we have to be really conscious of the fact that Al Jazeera television is owned by the Qatari royal family. Full stop. Totally owned. 100% owned by the Qatar. Qatar is a big U.S. runway, by the way. 80% of the population is foreign exploited labor in Qatar. It is not a real state. It is definitely a military runway. It has reputed to have the biggest U.S. airbase in the world. Al Jazeera was a project that was intended to be a joint venture between the BBC and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had cold feet. They wanted to censor the material as it goes through a transmission center in Rome. Obviously, the BBC, by its charter, cannot allow pre-censorship by the Saudi royal family. Otherwise, the whole of the BBC would have had to shut down. So they pulled out of the project. The project nearly died. The Qatari royal family intervened, bought all the rights. Half the BBC Arabic journalists went to Al Jazeera as part of the original project. And ever since, Al Jazeera has had a sectarian agenda. If you watch it carefully, and I do as part of my job in the university as well, its output is sectarian. It has very brave, intrepid journalists that I salute myself, but the overall agenda was sectarian, and it has been. They exposed themselves completely, obviously, once the Egyptian revolution started and once Libya came along and Syria and so on, and their sectarian agenda became very open. That they show footage of Malian people supporting the French colonialist troops. I remind you of the world media showing Iraqis welcoming US forces. That iconic image of Saddam's statue being pulled down in a famous square in Baghdad. There were 300 people in that square. About 200 of them were foreign journalists that were brought in by the US forces themselves, and the other 100 were Iraqis who were flown in from Bulgaria and Eastern Europe as part of Ahmed Chalabi's and Raghi Omar of the BBC is on the record. He was in that square. He said, I was fooled, and the whole thing was staged to show that the Iraqi people were welcoming the US gendarme in Baghdad. On democracy, I think that is really vital. I do insist that imperialism fears democracy, even here in London and in Washington. It is a people's democracy, working class democracy they fear. And when democracy doesn't work, they abolish it. Remember Margaret Thatcher when she abolished the election of the Greater London Council here because of a radical social democrat, I would call, like Ken Livingstone. They abolished that election. Allende in Chile, because it produced an anti-imperialist, relatively anti-imperialist government, they killed Allende and they staged a CIA coup. We were earlier reminded of the great African leader, Patrice Lumumba. He was the first elected African leader. They had to kill him because he was anti-imperialist. That's why I started my talk today about the vitality of the link between genuine democracy and the fight against imperialist domination, economic, political, etc. So, I'm fully aware that democracy doesn't mean just this paper in the ballot box every 4 years, although it is important that we elect our representatives. But it's also important that we can remove them. It's also important that the media is not owned by the likes of Murdoch and so on. It is the Murdochs of this world and the BBC and so on which show how frightened they are of democracy, actually. Their domination of the media. They don't want the British people to hear the truth about imperialist wars, about exploitation of the working class here. So there is that integral fear of genuine democracy, people's democracy.
Stephen, can you be brief?
I'll be brief. Democracy also means the democratization of voice, and the correct use of terminology and theoretical tools to understand this world. We are asked not to use the word imperialism. We are asked not to use the word Eurocentric. We are asked not to use the words white supremacy. It makes victims of people. We are asked not to talk about neocolonialism because then we're making victims of the colonized. Well, we could discuss, couldn't we? We could discuss sexual discrimination and never use the word patriarchy. We could discuss sexual discrimination and never use the words male chauvinism. We could discuss these issues, never use those concepts, because to use those concepts would be making victims of women. Of course, in the latter example, I'm talking nonsense, aren't I? I'm talking nonsense. Now, moving away from talking nonsense to talking about the issues which I would have to be brief about, Algeria has shown happy, smiling, clapping Malians welcoming the French intervening forces. I used to be really into history when I was a kid, and unfortunately I grew up in the UK, so it was Eurocentric British history that I watched, and World War II was a big one, and it still is. And I remember scenes of the Anschluss and happy, clapping, smiling Austrians welcoming the Germans who took over Austria and made it part of the Reich. I remember watching happy, clapping, smiling people from the Sudetenland, which was part of Czechoslovakia. The Germans went in. They were smiling. They were happy. When the Germans went into Eastern Europe and the eastern parts of the Soviet Union, again, the newsreel showed happy, clapping, smiling people. So again, my brother Sami, sitting next to me, has said in detail that which relates to the contemporary reality about happy, clapping, smiling people. Democracy is about democratization, and it's the empowering of the of people and empowering of voice. And Sami also reflected upon the need of to be wary of the media. Myself, I am part of a collective, a radio collective called Another World is Possible Radio, set up by my brother Explo Nani Kofi there, which is about the liberation, in part, about the liberation of African grassroots voice. We have Emil Carbo at the background there, who's also another one of the members of the Another World is Possible collective. And if you're free between 7 and 9 p.m. every Tuesday, tune into GFM radio and listen to that voice. But democratization must mean the freeing up of voice and the potential that comes when people are able to express their full humanity. We have seen the vicious way in which the media has reacted to the death of Comrade Chavez this past week. Vicious. And we are told that he was somehow suppressing voice in Venezuela, when what he was doing was liberating the airwaves and saying to those voices of the media who used media outlets to initiate, support a coup, to say, hang on a minute, I might look again at your license to be undemocratic. Democracy and media are together.
Let's take the last 4 questions.
Yeah, hi. You said the Qatar is a runway for the U.S. and the AFRICOM by the Pentagon that was set up in 2006 or 7, 1 year after the Chinese decided to give $20 billion in loans to Africa. So the Chinese are building the construction sites, they're giving money to the Africans, they are setting all this investment stuff in the continent, while the French, basically NATO, the French and the Americans are trying to jockey for positions in providing arms. How is that fight for hearts and minds going to be between China and NATO in Africa? And how are the Africans going to receive this, maybe for Mr. Kevin and Kofi, Walid and everybody?
I hope mine is a simple question, but in the face of the fact that any intervention from anybody with an agenda is going to cause further problems down the line, and you can establish that no intervention is possibly the best option. But are there any solid examples of things that have worked themselves out without intervention that can be used if people counter your argument for non-intervention?
Excellent.
I'd just like to take the opportunity, because we are a bit moved on from the subject, initial subject, which was global war on terror, to actually situation of many African countries. And can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just wanted to say about the point you made about we need within Africa, African solutions, and to point out the regimes in different countries in Africa. But I don't think there is any homogeneity about talking about Africa as a whole. So I think there are different situations, and they have to be looked in detail, each one of them. But talking about Mali, and ATT. We saw last year a movement called Liberation of Azawad movement, and it was against the Malian regime. And this takes the form of to talk about, they're not looking at overthrowing the regime, not changing the situation, but actually building a new form of what I would call, in this case, was not a Tuareg nationalism, but what they called an Azawad nationalism, by drawing a territory. But the problem is, in Africa, you won't get any support of any other African country. And that's why we go into intervention of other African countries. We saw they were absolutely against as well. But at some point backing up actually French intervention, which is quite interesting. But I was just saying about Africa, which is important for African unity. It's really hard to talk about African unity today, especially when you are a movement which takes the form of a national movement and contesting, trying to change the border, and trying to you are a threat to the national project in Africa. And we talk about Modibo Keita in the 60s, and he actually as well repressed a rebellion with the backup of Algeria as well, who Algeria was giving back all the rebels who were fighting and crossing the border. They were actually giving them back to Algeria, to Malian authorities, which is the point I wanted to make here. Is, it's going to be really hard if we see the solutions in Africa taking the form of national movements and secessionist movements. We may see not more like unity in Africa, but more division. Okay. And in about 200 years, we may have 100 countries in Africa, and a lot of them won't be recognized. And there is one actually who has been doing this and hasn't been still recognized for maybe something like 20 years, but correctly, it's Somaliland in East Africa. So what's the future of Mali if they don't even, yeah, I'm finishing the question. If they don't even, sort out the conflict within Mali.
Thanks.
I wanted to respond to what the lady who was sitting there was saying, but she's obviously gone now. She mentioned about how, why would China be investing in a place like Africa, because the people who were there, which I thought was actually quite offensive. But obviously she's not there. But I just want to say that in terms of people not understanding that Africans, we have a vision. We have great men and women who have visions. And the problem that's always been ongoing is that when these great men and women, visionaries like Thomas Sankara, Marcus Garvey, when they come up with the idea of unity, it is the same white supremacist system that goes out of their way to actually kill them. So the idea that we don't have leaders is actually unacceptable. I'm a Pan-African, and one of the things that Europeans have done to the minds of Africans is to see a fellow African as a country. Africans don't see themselves as Africans. I'm Malian, I'm Congolese, and I keep saying, look at me, I'm African, we share skin color. They don't see that. This is what has been done to the minds of Africans, that they are not Africans, they are actually countries, they are subjects. And these are the kind of issues which has left Africans being disunited. So the way forward, for Pan-Africans, Nkrumah literally made it very clear, the solution for Africa. We need to unite. We need one army. If we have one army, the problems in Mali and Nigeria can be dealt with, because if you have one army, Europe cannot come and just intervene and murder and kill people. The army could stand firm and stable and deal with Europe. When Nkrumah came up with the idea of Africa having one unity, one army, white supremacy decided to stage a coup, depose him out of Africa from Ghana, and then copy his idea into so-called European Union to unite themselves. and have one army, which they use and go all over the world killing other people. So we need to understand that we do have intelligent men, we have great leaders. Their ideas are stolen by white supremacy and used for their own agenda.
Okay.
So, you know, we can do it. We can unite and we can fight and we can liberate ourselves.
Yes.
He's been raising his hands for a long time.
The question I wanted to raise was about democracy that the brother there addressed, about African-oriented democracy instead of Western-imported democracy. And the question was, my next question was for the brother there about his conception about importing the Western-imported solutions. You were saying that the British brought peace to Sierra Leone, etc. I don't want to take it personal, but I thought it was the West African countries that brought peace to Sierra Leone instead of the British. The British went and extracted their so-called citizens from Sierra Leone. And if you could give me one example where the West has brought solution to anywhere they've gone to intervene.
Okay. Walid, can you pick up on the question of the Tuareg and the Azawad nationalism and also the sanctity of the borders?
Nationalism is very dangerous. And I'm going to pick up on what the lady, especially in a place like Africa, because the borders are largely artificial. We're talking about African unity, and maybe one day we will achieve peace and African unity, and we will refuse the Nobel Prize, unlike the European Union. But the issue here, when you have the Tuareg, for example, they asked for a patch of land that anthropologically extends over to Niger, to Algeria, to Mauritania. The solution, having, as you said, 100 countries down the line, it's of course going to create more conflicts. The issue is more unity, less borders on a regional base where there is homogeneous. Where you have, for example, in the Maghreb, where you have society culturally and religiously and historically a bit more or less homogeneous in certain parts, but yes, divided by borders like the case of Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia. This is the kind of blocks that they need. Economic integration, but most importantly, political and institutional integration. And it's not that we do not have. The African Union supposedly has an army. ECOWAS has an army. But whenever it really comes down to actually doing things, they all of a sudden show them on French television, the Malian soldiers shooting with just mimicking the sound because they don't want to waste bullets. This is the reality of things because they get blocked. Because the states are corrupt, and that means that the funding is conditional, and that means that they can't do it, so they have to ask the French and so on and so forth. The question of China, I'm going to just touch on it very quickly. Yeah, China is changing the certain relationships and the dynamics in many African places. I'm going to give you an example in Niger, for example. They've been, because they have access to huge funding, they've been building refineries, oil refineries in Niger, something that, the West would take ages to propose a project. The Chinese, they come, they do it, they construct, and now the relationship between Niger and Nigeria is changing because Niger want to pump up the oil, refine it, and then export it to Nigeria, when in Nigeria they need more. So there is a lot of dynamics that the Chinese are involved with, and it's changing the relationship between, the big power Nigeria and its little poor brother Niger, who's one day, thanks to the Chinese or not thanks to the Chinese, is going to start exporting to Nigeria. So there are very interesting dynamics to look at. I'm not sure if they're all benign.
Yes, just to support that point that secession is not going to help advance the cause of Africa, because even if you talk about Azawad, which is northern Mali, the Tuaregs are not the majority there. And the Tuareg question, we have to make sure clear that it's not a Mali question. In Azawad, there are even rival militias. The Songhai also have the Gadakoi, the Fulani have the Ganda Izo, the Arabs have the National Front for the Liberation of Azawad. And even these groups are competing among themselves. So if the news makes it appear as if it's just the national movement for the liberation of Azawad, which is there and is leading the whole of Northern Mali to independence. That is not the complete story. Because Ganda Koi, which represents Songhai, who are also as many as the Tuaregs in Northern Mali, goes again fighting the national movement for the liberation of Azawad. So the full story, the fuller story, that the case of secession will not advance. In fact, Africa needs more unity. A unified Africa can find ways of renegotiating these artificial boundaries peacefully. And so what we need is a unified Africa, a confederation, and then we can find ways of solving some of these problems. With regards to the Chinese and West competition, I think the solution is for Africa itself to be in control of its resources. That is the only way out.
Okay, I'll comment on your question about giving some examples where non-intervention has led to some progress in parts of the world. And actually, if you look at the world map, wherever there was any progress, it was because people rose with their own volition. They made sacrifices. Even if you look at Britain, any of the rights we have today and the fact we can sit in this hall and talk probably dates back to the Chartist movement of the mid-19th century and the demands of the working class for trade union rights and the right to organize and so on. So it is people's risings. The Great Russian Revolution, 1918, that made enormous progress and eventually, I think, in my own mind, ultimately destroyed through foreign intervention. Some 30 countries invaded the new Soviet Union. The Chinese Revolution made enormous progress until the Japanese invasion and British and imperialist intervention. The Middle East, Iraq made enormous advances until they intervened in the, I'm talking about the 1950s now. Iran, Mossadegh, Prime Minister of Iran, started making progress, wanted to nationalize Iranian oil, and the CIA went in and overthrew him. The plot was hatched here by MI6, that's on the record, by the way, and they gave the plan to Roosevelt's grandson, who was the US ambassador in Tehran, and they engineered incidents in Iran, and they overthrew Mossadegh. Mossadegh, Lumumba started making progress, and they intervened. They snuff any potential of the people rising and determining their own future. Vietnam, the revolution there started unifying the people, kicking out the French colonial rulers in Vietnam. The United States took over and started smashing the Vietnamese people's revolution. Chile, Allende started making progress when the people were relatively free, relatively democratic. I don't pretend that these were great socialist democracies. And they went in through a CIA coup and killed Allende and killed thousands of people. In Iraq, it was the 1963 fascist coup that brought ultimately Saddam and the Ba'athist fascists to power in Iraq. Wherever you look, Egypt started making a bit of progress under Nasser. They undermined him, and he made concessions to the United States in the end. And wherever you look in the world, you'll see that if people are determined enough, they go and rise, they make progress. They overthrow their local masters. And the imperialists don't like this. They intervene to snuff it out. And that is the picture, I'm afraid, across the world. I just finish on this. And now in the Middle East, some Arab writers use the phrase that the imperialists are now, because they divided the Arab world to all these artificial borders. They did the same in Africa, I'm sure. They are saying that imperialism now is trying to divide the divided and splitting the split. So this is the phase we're in. They want to create figments of little statelets, Shia, Sunni, Christian, and they'll split those as well into Orthodox and Catholic and so on and so forth. Across the globe, you'll see that they want to undermine the very order they created post-World War I and post-World War II because it doesn't suit them anymore, and through inter-imperial conflicts, they are subdividing the divided. Thank you.
Kevin, some last comments?
I really like that expression, subdividing the divided. It's I think we're all here because of an understanding and a need for unity, and imperialism's task is to subdivide the divided. Brief comments about Chinese capital in Africa. Transnational capital is transnational capital. That's my brief comment. We could talk about Brazilian capital in Africa. We could talk about Indian capital in Africa. We could talk about the Gulf states buying up land in Africa. But transnational capital's interests are transnational capital's interests, and we shouldn't be diverted too much. Obviously, there's nuance to be played out, but we shouldn't be diverted too much by the nationality of transnational capital, because capital's interests, just like mafia interests, are mafia interests. At the end of the day, they couldn't care less with regards to who they distort. In conclusion, just to conclude, to say thank you to Algeria Solidarity Campaign. It's been excellently organised today, and I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak with you. But in conclusion, because I started by talking about law, so I want to end about talking about law. And it's not because I put law up on a pedestal or feel it's kind of like God-given or handed down to us, and I'm upset because the brutish imperialists aren't behaving and abiding by the law. Crudely speaking, we all know that the law is a tool made for and by the rich for the purposes of the rich's interest. But we all know that. Even the rich know that. Now, what do? If we join together in trying to create a new conceptualization of what human rights means, if we talk about grassroots interdependence, where we are dependent upon ourselves, we will create another normalization of understanding this world. And when there are conflicts in the global south, in Africa or wherever else, we wouldn't immediately think that the solution is the liberal West's intervention. This has been so normalized that we just shrug our shoulders and think, well, what else? As someone said, what are we going to say to the children? And we forget that there are millions of other children who we say nothing to. We say nothing to because it serves Western interests and Western media to be silent about the suffering of those children.
I think we need to bring this stimulating discussion to an end. But just to conclude, I'm going to quote a few words from wise Algerian politicians, Abdelhamid Mahri, who passed away last year, just to touch on your point, Hajar. So what he said, if you don't want to be changed by the others, you have to change yourself. Democracy is not only an ethical necessity, it is equally a national security imperative. Therefore, dictatorship and authoritarianism are real existential threats and objective allies to imperialism. I would like to thank our speakers for their excellent contributions. Thank you for joining us today for these stimulating discussions. Please enjoy the refreshments outside and we can discuss further.